Now that Nixon is done, after the Watergate scandal, moving on to Ford and Carter. All right, last presidents here from the 70s that we'll talk about, and we'll be done with the 60s and 70s. This is my last lecture from this unit. So, Gerald Rudolph Ford Jr., our 38th president. Okay, takes over after Nixon resigns. So a little bit of his background. He was actually born something different. Okay, we've had a couple of presidents change their name in the modern times, and he'll be one of them. He was born Leslie Lynch King Jr. in Nebraska. But his father was an abusive, awful person, so his mother took him and left. And he will later change his name to Gerald Rudolph Ford Jr. to honor his stepfather, who he saw as his actual dad. He will go on to the University of Michigan and be a football star. After he graduates Michigan, he goes to Yale for law school. Then he goes and serves in the Naval Reserves during World War II. He will be a congressman from Michigan for 25 years. He wins a lot of elections, right? Before becoming president through the 25th Amendment again. So he was a congressman, right? And you can hold two roles as a congressman. You can be a congressman and the Speaker of the House if your party is in control of that chamber, right? So right now the Democrats have more elected officials in the Congress, so a Democrat gets to be the Speaker of the House. So the Democrats vote, and they chose Nancy Pelosi to be the Speaker of the House. It was the same thing, but reversed back then. The Republicans had more people in the House, so they got to choose who was going to be their Speaker, and they chose Gerald Ford. Because Nixon had to resign, and because the Vice President had to resign, then next in line is Speaker of the House, which at this point is Gerald Ford, and he becomes president. Remember, we called him the illegitimate president because he did not receive any votes for that office. Some pictures of Ford. On the left, we've got him playing football at Michigan. On the middle there is the Naval Reserve guy, and on the right, his presidential portrait. First question on Ford. Who was the illegitimate president? The one that was not elected by the people. Was it Nixon, Carter, Ford, or Reagan? All right. Plug in the camera there. So, Ford's presidency will be short and uneventful. Mostly worthless, okay? Not a president that we have to learn a whole ton about. Biggest mistake I think he makes, or maybe not the biggest, but one of the biggest mistakes he makes is pardoning Nixon. We talked about that during the Nixon PowerPoint. His economy will continue to be bad, plagued by stagflation, right? Which means high or stagnant economy and high inflation. That continues throughout his presidency. He had one plan for it. He called it WHIP, which was to whip inflation. Now it was called whip inflation now, which was really just him talking about people cutting down inflation, which really wasn't an actual policy. He does go to the Helsinki Conference to finalize post-World War II agreements throughout Europe and the USSR. But the Soviets broke some promises. We might have too, but the Soviets broke more of them, and our relations get a lot worse. They also treated Ford like he wasn't very important because he wasn't elected and all this stuff. They didn't see him as a legitimate person to negotiate with, so that doesn't go very well. Our relations during the Ford presidency, our relations with the Soviets were very, very bad. Saigon falls to the communists in Vietnam in 1975. That's really nothing to do with Ford because the troops had already been withdrawn and all that sort of stuff, but it happens. Then we have the Mayaguez incident. Okay, a U.S. ship, the Mayaguez, is seized by communists in Cambodia. So what does Ford do? He sends the Marines to attack and get the ship back. 39 people and the ship are released, and 38 Marines die. So it wasn't seen as a very big success. And the president gets blamed for stuff like that. So on the left there, he is pardoning Nixon over a television announcement. On the right, the headline from the New York Times the next morning. So true or false? Relations between the United States and the Soviet Union got better during the Ford presidency. All right, that's it for Ford. Told you, short and uneventful. So Ford runs in the election of 1976 against Carter. Ford beat Reagan in the Republican primary, and he'll go against Carter. It ends up being a pretty close election. Okay, Carter ran as a pretty conservative Democrat. Okay, he was not a big liberal Democrat. He questioned how large the federal government was, how involved the federal government was, and he will openly welcome more religion into public life. He was one of our most religious presidents, one of our most pious presidents. He taught Sunday school and all that stuff. He was very much into his religion. He grew up on a peanut farm, not like a small peanut farm, a really big one. His dad was pretty well connected too. Was in the Navy, eventually became the governor of Georgia, saw him as a political outsider. And people really didn't like Washington, D.C. at this point after the whole Watergate thing and the pardoning of Nixon and all of that. Carter's going to win with 51% of the popular vote, and he wins the Electoral College 297 to 240, which is actually, I know it looks like it's not very close, it's actually pretty close from an electoral standpoint. So you can see basically the East and the South votes for Carter and the West votes for Ford. Ronald Reagan did get some write-in votes in there as well, and he will win a very small percentage in that election. So true or false, Carter ran as a liberal Democrat. So there's Jimmy Carter, James Earl Jimmy Carter Jr., our 39th president. So background on him, born and raised in Georgia. Father was a farmer and a community leader before becoming a congressman for the state of Georgia. Jimmy will serve in the Navy from 1946 1961. He graduates the Naval Academy, which is hard to get into. He actually studied a lot of science stuff, including nuclear physics, nuclear sciences, which will help him understand some of the stuff. Like we talk about 3 Mile Island and nuclear disasters like Chernobyl. He understands that stuff at a much higher level than what we'd expect from a guy who is colloquially known as a peanut farmer. Anyways, he becomes a state senator for Georgia, then eventually becomes the Georgia governor, and then eventually the president of the United States. So on the left, young Jimmy in the Navy. In the middle, medium-aged Jimmy when he becomes president. And on the far right, old Jimmy. He is our oldest living president. He's still kicking around in his 90s. He's a much better ex-president, but we'll get to that later. So, domestic policy. Achievements. Trying to end some of the anger over Vietnam that was still very present. He will give amnesty to draft dodgers, so people that refused to enter the draft, he will pardon them. He will establish the peacetime draft system, though. He was an army, he was a military man. He helps create the Department of Education, which is still a government-level position that's not being run particularly great in the recent years, but is important. He will reform the civil service to make it more merit-based, so you have to earn your position, which is good. He helped create the Department of Energy. Okay, he created it to help reduce our dependence on foreign oil, and to do that, he also raised the gas tax and taxed cars that guzzled gas, which made him not particularly popular in some parts of the country, especially, say, like Detroit or Michigan at this point, which still produce a lot of cars. We have a second fuel shortage caused by the Iranian Revolution, which we're going to talk about here in a moment, which is a huge part of Carter's legacy and American history for the last 40, 50 years. So, draft amnesty right there. So, Carter helped create the departments, or during his presidency, the departments of what were created. There are 2 of these that are correct. A, the Interior. B, Education. C, Energy. Or D, Defense. So, the economy under him. Economy still wasn't great. Like I said, stagflation continues throughout the rest of his presidency into mostly the whole first term of the Reagan presidency too. He'll try to reduce inflation, but then interest soars, which hurt auto and home sales, which made the economy a little bit worse. He will convince Congress to pass an $18 billion tax cut during this. Unemployment lower than Nixon. It's at 7.5%. Inflation, though, goes up higher than it was under Nixon to 12%. He will favor a bunch of deregulation, which is not something that Democrats tend to favor a ton, although Carter and Clinton will be big Democrats in favor of deregulation. So if you look at his actual economic policy, it's pretty conservative, right? It's things that Republicans enjoyed, right? Like tax cuts and deregulation. The environment. He creates the Superfund site system, and literally what Superfunds mean is we spend more money fixing those areas to help clean up toxic waste. There's a place called Love Canal. That'll be the first Superfund site where literally businesses just poured tons and tons and tons of different chemical waste there, and it hurt a lot of people. He established controls over strip mining. He protects more than 100 miles of Alaskan coast, But during his presidency, the 3 Mile Island disaster happens, and that'll basically be the end of nuclear power here in America, at least on a large scale. For review, there were these beads, these chemical beads that were put into the nuclear reactor as part of its usual process of creating electricity. Those beads jammed up the machine, forcing it to overheat. And the only thing that the people there could do to stop it becoming a complete meltdown, which would lead to an explosion, a lot more radiation being exposed, a lot of people dying, kind of like what happened in the Ukraine at Chernobyl under the Soviet Union. They released a lot of toxic air or toxic gas into the atmosphere. And they actually tracked the cloud of toxic dust as it settled over the Atlantic Ocean. But that was a huge moment in American history, and it kind of ends up being the end of nuclear power. So anyways, there's Carter versus inflation on the Time magazine cover. Love Canal, okay? 82 different chemicals were mixed in this canal for 25 years, which led to people with birth defects, sickness, and early death in that area. So they had to designate it as a Superfund site and fix it. On the right, the signpost for the 3 Mile nuclear accident off of Pennsylvania. So, trying to fix the economy, which two things did Carter do? A, increase taxes. B, cut taxes. C, increase regulations. Or D, cut regulations. Foreign policy under Carter, mostly failures. A couple of small good things and then mostly huge failures. So, first, he believed in humanitarian diplomacy, which means he wanted to base our foreign policy on human rights, which is an awesome idea. All countries should base their foreign policy on human rights. Of course, it was super inconsistent and ultimately ineffective because we really don't care that much about human rights. We care about it more than a lot of other countries do, but we care more about doing what's in our best interest, right? Like if we cared really about human rights, we might try to change the leadership in Saudi Arabia, which beheads more people every year than all terror groups combined. We could do something like that, right? If we really cared about the human rights of people there, but we like our relationship with Saudi Arabia, so we're not going to change it, right? Inconsistencies like that plagues the Carter administration and plagues every administration. Panama Canal Treaty. He will officially sign the treaty that gives Panama back the Panama Canal. Remember, we owned the Panama Canal from the day it was built all the way until 1999. Now, Carter was president in the 70s, so he signs this agreement and says, hey, in 20 some odd years, you get your canal back. The Camp David Accords will be another positive of his foreign policy, the last positive, probably. Will be a negotiated peace. He has the leaders of Egypt and Israel come together and negotiate a peace because they were about to go to war with each other. He will sign on to the SALT II treaty with the Soviet Union to limit arms again, but that will not be passed by the Senate, so that never becomes a thing. Now, huge failures of Carter in both Afghanistan and Iran that will have long-lasting implications. He will not be the only president that does dumb things in these countries, but he'll be the last, or he'll be a very central figure in the dumb things in these countries. So, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979, right? And we're going to throw a whole big stink about this. What you don't normally learn is that we kind of made the whole thing happen. We engineered the invasion. We armed resistance fighters in Afghanistan and told them to shoot at Soviet leaders that were there, and eventually the Soviets will invade. We wanted them to do this because we didn't think that they would do well in Afghanistan. Afghanistan traditionally is a hard place to invade and rule. But even on top of that, if there's a lot of people fighting, it's going to drain resources from the Soviet Union. We literally wanted it to be their version of Vietnam, right? We were involved in Vietnam for a long time. A lot of Americans died, and we wasted a lot of money there. We want them to do the same thing in Afghanistan, so we engineer this invasion. They invaded, right? They wanted to prop up and support their communist government there that was already in place, and we continued to arm the resistance that was fighting to topple the government. We didn't do this directly. We did this through Pakistan. Right? We give Pakistan money and weapons, and then they would choose which Afghani fighters to give those money and weapons to. With all this stuff, we engineered this, then we boycott the 1980 Olympics. Right? We said because of the Soviets' actions, we are going to boycott the Olympics. It makes us look weak. And I feel tremendously bad for all those Olympians that work so hard to get there and then don't get to participate because the Soviets invaded a country that we got them to invade. So, as we're arming the Afghan freedom fighters, who were known as the Mujahideen, right? One of their leaders, Osama bin Laden, will come to prominence, right? So, Basically what happens is there were 7 big groups in the Mujahideen, right? The Mujahideen wasn't like, it's not like a country, it's just what we called the different freedom fighting groups, I guess, in Afghanistan. So there's 7 of them. 3 of them were pretty moderate, and 4 of them were really radical, what we'd call Islamic fundamentalists at this time. It just happened that the Islamic fundamentalists, number 1, were better fighters, or I should say more vicious fighters against the communist Soviets, but also those 4 were a lot closer to the political leadership in Pakistan. So they got most of the funding, which means not only did these very radical Islamic groups get more funding and more weapons, but they also killed off the more moderate groups later on, right? So it's part of the reason that Afghanistan becomes so radical, becomes ruled by the Taliban, which is itself a fundamentalist Islamic group, and eventually becomes a base for terror activity, is because we helped arm those people who were into that sort of a thing. And then I'll talk about what happens in Afghanistan later, but we leave and let them figure it out. And so who figures it out? Of course, the people that have most of the guns. And they happen to be the most radical of the people there. So here we was the Camp David Accords. There's a question coming up. I'll go back a slide. So the advisor, the foreign policy advisor that came up with this idea, his last name was Brzezinski. He was interviewed about this much later, before he died. He's dead now. But in the 90s, he said that he didn't feel bad about it at all, because he said, what's more dangerous, the Soviet Union, the communists, or some angry Muslims in the Middle East, right? And that comes back to bite us pretty hard in recent history. Anyways, the Camp David Accords between a few countries, making sure we have some peace in the Middle East. Okay, that wasn't the question. So I didn't want to say the countries in case that was part of the question, but it was Egypt and Israel. All right, so here's your question. Carter's foreign policy successes included what? A, the Camp David Accords. B, the Panama Canal Treaty. C, the SALT II Treaty. Or D, all of the above. All right, picture the Soviets invading Afghanistan. In the middle there, you see some Mujahideen fighters with a rocket launcher, shooting them probably at some Soviets. Here's the Soviet Union on a map, right? And you can see, I'll stand up to show you, you can see, this is the Soviet Union, right? These are countries that the Soviets basically control. And then there's Afghanistan. And they helped install a communist government in Afghanistan. At some points, in some ways, it was much better than the government that follows, right? Women had equal rights there. Everybody went to school and all that sort of thing. Of course, when the Taliban takes over, that drastically changes. But there are also bad things, obviously, under Soviet leadership. So true or false, we helped engineer the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Is that true? Is that false? All right, the Iranian Revolution is the other big thing during the Carter administration. Now, Carter is not solely to blame for this. He should not be solely to blame for this. Okay, it was an entirely American failure for a long, long time. But he will make things worse in some very key ways. So in 1953, we talked about this. The United States CIA helped successfully lead an overthrow of the Iranian government, replacing their leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, with the Shah Riza Khan, to promote both American and British oil interests. So the Shah was awful. He was an awful and repressive leader. Okay, he ran the country not for Iranians. He ran the country for American and British oil companies, basically. He shipped out almost all the oil and all the proceeds with it. He stayed in charge through brutality, right? Having a secret police that arrested all political dissent or dissenters, or put people in prison. They tortured people, killed people, bad things. He was not a good person. But we liked him, and the British liked him because we made a lot of money off of Iranian oil. So the Iranians get fed up with this, and they remove the Shah through the Iranian Revolution, right? This is in 1979. They replace him with the Ayatollah, the first Ayatollah Khomeini. We allowed the Shah to come to the United States for medical treatments. Okay, he had cancer, and he was gone. He wasn't in Iran when the revolution happens. He gets out, right? And so he asked, can I come to America, right? Jimmy Carter had praised him as one of our great friends and one of the great people in the Middle East and all this other BS. So we let him in for cancer treatments. In response, 400 Iranian people, mainly students, will storm the American embassy in Tehran and take 52 Americans hostage. They hold them for 400 days. They wanted to punish the Shah. Basically, the deal was, if you give us the Shah, we give you back all these people. We did not allow that to happen. We said, no, we're not trading hostages, we're not negotiating with terrorists and all that sort of stuff. All because we didn't want the Shah, I guess, to get punished. So, the Iranians, they originally had more than 52 hostages, but they released all minorities. They said, America treats you badly enough, we're not going to keep you here and be worse to you. And they released some of the women as well, saying the same thing. Carter will do everything short of giving up the Shah. He'll do everything else through economic pressure or economic bonuses, through political and military pressure or positive things. He'll do everything he can to get them released. The Iranians were never, ever, ever going to release the hostages to Carter unless Carter gave up the Shah. And since he wouldn't do that, they weren't going to do anything positive for Carter. They wanted Carter not to get elected again, right? So literally, as soon as Reagan gets elected, they release the hostages. They get some stuff out of it. They weren't just giving him up out of the kindness of their heart, but we call this the Iran hostage crisis, right? It does not do well for Carter's presidential hopes. So Iran now is what we call a theocracy, right? It's ruled based by clerical decrees by the Ayatollah, right? They do have a president. They do vote for president. It's not the freest form of elections or anything like that. But again, the Iranian people would much rather be ruled by their own mostly corrupt leadership than be ruled by corrupt American or British cronies. There is not a strong, I mean, there is protests there and stuff like that, but there is not a strong movement to overthrow the president or the Ayatollah or anything like that. So they're still in that position. So why did Iran have a revolution in the year 1979? Was it A, because the Shah was brutal and repressive? Is it B, because the U.S. allowed the Shah in for medical treatments? Was it C, because they wanted to denationalize their oil fields? All right, C. Or is it D, none of the above? All right, so on the Time magazine cover, we tried to make the Ayatollah look like, I guess, a zombie. The test of wills between that zombie Ayatollah and President Carter. You can see there in the middle, them storming the American embassy in Tehran. On the right, you can see our hostages being held there in Iran. 400 days they were held. So through economic and diplomatic pressure, President Carter was able to get these hostages released. Is that true or is that false? All right, so 1980, Carter runs for re-election against Reagan and had absolutely zero chance of winning. The economy wasn't very great, and the Iran hostage crisis really destroyed his chances, so this is not going to be much of an election. Okay, Reagan was a former actor who became much more conservative towards the end of his acting days, becomes a politician and eventually the governor of California. He had become the leading voice for conservative Republican values by basically parroting Goldwater's 1964 platform. He believed there should be a smaller federal government, more power to the states, trickle-down economics, and he was going to bring back prayer in schools. Obviously, the federal government hasn't gotten any smaller. He didn't really make it any smaller. More power to the states in some regards does happen, but not really. Trickle-down economics does happen, or at least he institutes it. And we've talked about trickle-down economics in the past, and we'll talk more about Reagan here in the future, but it doesn't really get passed down to us. It never does. And obviously, prayer in schools doesn't come back. But prayer in schools was a big thing for him to promise because it'll help get the evangelical vote for Reagan. Carter defended his record, but he was very uninspiring. So, like I said, not a close election. Okay, Reagan wins in an absolute landslide, 489 to 49, which is, as far as someone running for re-election, that's as big of a butt-kicking as you can get. Carter only wins, 6 states, and Reagan wins the rest. So, after presidency, Carter will be a much more important figure and much better figure after being president than he was actually as president. He creates the Carter Center to advance human rights and alleviate human suffering. The nonprofit, non-governmental center promotes democracy, mediates and prevents conflicts, and monitors the electoral process in support of free and fair elections throughout the world. In 2002, he got the Nobel Peace Prize for his work to find peaceful solutions to international conflicts, to advance democracy and human rights, and to promote economic and social development through his center. He helped form Habitat for Humanity and still goes and helps them build houses even though he's in his 90s. He helped with a lot of hurricane relief efforts in the last few times, and he's been very critical of every administration following his. So that part you can take or leave, but he's a much more important former president than he ever really was as president. So there he is with Nelson Mandela on the left when Mandela was released from prison and became president of South Africa. And on the right there he is with his wife, I believe. I'm not sure if she's still alive. I'd have to look that up. But then building a house. Habitat for Humanity builds low-income housing for poor people. You still have to pay for it, but your mortgage is very low because it was built affordably. Anyways, Carter's still around, still kicking. But that's the end of the Ford and Carter lecture, and this is the last lecture of the 60s and 70s unit. So I'll be back. For AP, I won't be back with this stuff. It'll be all review. But for regular US, I'll be back with the 80s all the way up until the present, which means lots of stuff on Reagan and Bush and Clinton and Bush and Obama. So we'll talk later.